The year is approximately 640 BC, and the location is the foot of the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Here, the engineering of the Roman state begins to manifest, not in the grandeur of its temples, but in the calculated negative space of its foundations. You observe the construction of the casa, known in later centuries as the Mamertine prison. This structure represents the primary blueprint for subterranean confinement, a departure from the open air holding pens of earlier tribal entities toward a deliberate architectural strategy of isolation. The Roman state required a mechanism for the temporary storage of human bodies, those awaiting trial, sentencing, or the eventual walk to the Tarpeian Rock. The engineering is utilitarian, brutal. The walls are composed of massive blocks of tufa, a volcanic rock quarried from the surrounding hills and hand-hewn into rough-edged polygons. You reach out and touch the wall, feel the cold, abrasive texture of the hand-hewn tufa stone scraping against your palm, a physical manifestation of the state's immovable authority. These stones are dry-fitted with such precision that they create a sealed subterranean envelope intentionally designed to survive for millennia. This architecture functions through total environmental control. The Mamertine consists of two stacked levels, the upper casa and the lower Tullianum. Access to the lower chamber is granted only through a circular hole in the floor, the oculus, through which prisoners are lowered by rope. This lower level serves as a stagnant reservoir for the city's waste and the state's enemies. The atmospheric conditions within these masonry walls are defined by a total absence of ventilation. You note the technical reality of the air quality. It is a heavy anaerobic environment, thick with the scent of damp earth and the metabolic waste of the confined. The humidity is constant, rising from the porous stone floors and the nearby Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome. This moisture facilitates the growth of specialized molds and provides a breeding ground for vermin. Rats move with impunity across the tufa blocks, their claws clicking against the stone in a landscape of total darkness. In the 7th century BC, light is a luxury denied to the incarcerated. Without the sun, the human circadian rhythm collapses, turning hours into days and days into a singular, amorphous stretch of time. Legal records from this era indicate that the Roman judicial process was not an accelerated one. While the Mamertine was designed as a holding facility, the bureaucratic reality of the Roman Republic and later Empire often resulted in extreme sentencing delays. You observe the record of a prisoner who has remained within this lightless tufa vault for nearly a decade. Prisoners could wait up to 10 years for a trial to occur, their physical health degrading in the damp, airless interior. This prolonged confinement was not technically the punishment itself. The Roman legal code generally favored execution, fines, or exile. But the structural reality of the prison turned the waiting period into a slow physiological siege. The lack of vitamin D and the high concentration of moisture leading to respiratory failure or joint rot were the unintended, yet effective, consequences of this masonry-based detention. The state did not need to actively torture when the architecture provided a passive, persistent degradation of the human form. As the centuries progress, the design of the Mamertine remains the standard for urban control. It is a monument to the Roman belief in order and the containment of chaos. However, as the Western Roman Empire begins its slow structural fracture, the centralized administration of such facilities starts to erode. The massive tufa blocks remain, but the legal mechanism that filled them begins to shift. The administrative focus of confinement begins to migrate from the Mediterranean heartland toward the northern reaches of Europe. The Roman model of confinement, based on civic oversight and subterranean masonry, inevitably gives way to a decentralized feudalism. As the Roman model of confinement faded, the 1066 Norman conquest introduced a new linguistic and legal architecture to the dungeon. The stone remains, but the power that commands the keys has changed forever. The year 1066 functions as a chronological and structural rupture in the history of the British Isles. The Norman conquest did not merely replace a ruling class, it re-engineered the very mechanisms of human accountability. While the Roman Mamertine had utilized the geological weight of stone to signify state dominance, The Normans introduced a more cerebral tool of control, the bureaucratization of language. You observe the transition from the fluid, oral traditions of Anglo-Saxon law, where justice was often communal and spoken in the vernacular, to a system predicated on the permanence of the written word. This shift necessitated a new architecture of authority centered around the keep and the administrative chamber. Inside these nascent stone fortifications, the air is distinctively dry, smelling of cured parchment and the acrid smoke of tallow candles. It is a stark sensory contrast to the damp, subterranean pits of the previous millennium. This was the moment the cell became not just a hole, but a record. In this new paradigm, the translation of justice from spoken English to written Norman French became the primary instrument of linguistic dominance. You stand within the courtroom, witnessing a process of systematic erasure. When a defendant speaks in the sharp, rhythmic vowels of Old English, their testimony undergoes a rigorous purification. Court scribes, positioned at heavy oak benches, translate these statements into the ornate scripts of Norman French for the official records. You hear the rhythmic, relentless scratching of a goosequill nib against vellum, a sound that dominates the silent chamber. This tactile act of writing is not a passive recording but an active transformation of reality. To the prisoner, the record being produced is illegible and impenetrable, yet it is this French text, and not their spoken word, that holds the legal weight of truth. The technical precision of the scribe's hand ensures that once a sentence is inscribed, it becomes an immutable part of the Crown's physical archive. This linguistic stratification extended its reach from the high benches of the court directly into the marrow of the prison system. For centuries following the conquest, Norman French remained the exclusive language of the courts and the conduits of incarceration. The legal terminology of larceny, felony, and parole took root here, acting as linguistic barbed wire. The impact of this forced bilingualism is most poignantly preserved in the material culture of the prison walls themselves. At Norwich Castle, the evidence of this linguistic imposition is etched directly into the masonry. You examine the graffiti left by a prisoner named Bartholomew. Unlike the crude markings of the illiterate, his plea for innocence is articulated in the formal Norman French of his captors. This choice of language was a strategic necessity. To communicate with the mechanism that held him, he had to adopt the tongue of the victors. The limestone walls, cold to the touch, serve as a ledger for these desperate translated proclamations. Furthermore, the Norman gavel introduced a shift in the pathology of confinement. Under the Anglo-Saxon system, many disputes were settled through blood compensation, a fiscal translation of violence. The Norman model, however, favored the physical seized state. The castle was no longer just a fortress, it was a warehouse for the human body during the slow grinding of the legal process. The administrative burden of this system was immense. As the number of detainees grew, the Crown required a method to manage the logistics of prolonged detention without straining the central treasury. The bureaucratic machine had created a surplus of bodies in wait, individuals caught in the linguistic trap between their English identity and the French law. The technical reality of the 11th century prison was one of increasing density and specialized roles. With the legal framework established, the Crown began outsourcing the management of these shadows to private larderers. The bureaucratic machinery established by the Norman administration in the decades following the conquest did not merely exist within the stone walls of courtrooms. It extended its reach into the deep, tactile reality of the English landscape. By 1135, the management of the king's resources had become a matter of hereditary entitlement and specialized oversight. You observe this transition in the figure of David, a man recorded in the official rolls as the first forest larderer of York. His title, the Larderer, suggests a role tied to the preservation of meat, but the reality of his office is far more expansive and custodial. He is the progenitor of a line that will command the forest jail for centuries, turning the administration of justice into a family enterprise. As you walk the perimeter of the jurisdiction, you see how the forest is no longer just a collection of trees, but a legal entity defined by the king's will and the larderer's ledger. The seat of this authority is Davy Hall, situated within the city of York but inextricably linked to the surrounding royal forests. This structure serves as a specialized site for those who have violated forest laws. These are individuals caught poaching the king's deer, felling timber without a license, or encroaching upon protected greenery. Unlike the general dungeons of the Shire, Davy Hall operates with a specific vocational focus. You note the physical structure of the site. It is a timber-framed outpost where the boundary between the wild woods and the urban center is blurred. The scent of rotting leaves and damp earth permeates the timber walls, a constant sensory reminder of the forest proximity and the decay inherent in prolonged confinement. This dampness carries the metallic tang of iron hinges and the sour odor of wet wool, grounding the administrative power of the office in a cycle of organic rot. The management of Davy Hall is a study in the fragmentation of medieval authority. While the Larderer holds the hereditary right to maintain the jail and profit from its fees, he does not operate in a vacuum. You observe the shifting layers of ownership and oversight that define the 12th century. The Sheriff of Yorkshire maintains a claim over certain incarcerated bodies, while the Mayor of York asserts the city's growing municipal influence. This overlap creates a complex web of jurisdictions where a prisoner might be held in a facility owned by one authority but regulated by another. The descendants of David will maintain this delicate balance, managing the forest jail and its lucrative administrative perks until the 15th century. Their longevity is a testament to the stability of hereditary offices in the face of shifting political tides. Inside the jail, the technical mechanisms of custody are visible in the heavy ledgers and the physical restraints applied to those awaiting trial before the forest justices. The forest laws are notoriously stringent, treating the king's flora and fauna with a reverence often denied to the peasantry. For the prisoner, the experience is one of atmospheric isolation. You watch as the Larderer's men mark the arrival of a new captive, recorded with the same clinical precision used for the barrels of salted venison that passed through the larder's stores. There is a chilling efficiency to the process. The prisoner is a resource to be managed, a potential source of fines to be extracted. The interior of the hall is perpetually dim, the light filtered through narrow apertures that allow the cool, moisture-laden air of the Yorkshire wilds to settle in the lungs of the inhabitants. This system of forest custody represents a crucial phase in the evolution of English penology. It is a period where the prison is often a private franchise, a hereditary asset passed down from father to son like a plot of land or a flock of sheep. The Davy family's control over the York Forest Jail for 300 years illustrates how deeply the concept of private management was embedded in the public legal system. You see the Larderer's descendants inspecting the timber foundations, repairing the thatch, and ensuring that the walls remain stout enough to hold those who dared to defy the forest charter. Every repair to the hall, every new bolt on the door, is a technical investment in the family's continued dominance over the local landscape. As the years progress from 1135, the small-scale, timber-based custody of the Larderers begins to feel like a relic of an older world. The administrative demands of the crown are expanding. The king's grip on his territory requires more than just forest outposts and hereditary keepers. It requires a display of permanence and architectural might that can overawe the populace. The reliance on timber and the localized damp of the woods begin to give way to a more formidable material. As forest outposts grew, the urban landscape saw the rise of massive stone fortresses designed for total control. The evolution of the English penal system in the early 14th century marked a transition from the rudimentary timber enclosures of the forest Larderers to the permanence of stone-carved urban confinement. By the year 1300, the Crown's administrative reach required a more specialized form of architecture, one that utilized the very physics of the earth to ensure the containment of its subjects. In the city of Nottingham, the construction of the jail utilized the natural bunter sandstone, a geological formation that allowed for the excavation of subterranean chambers with clinical efficiency. You observe the architectural shift from horizontal movement to verticality as the jail's master masons began the process of burrowing downward rather than building upward. This was not merely the creation of a cellar, it was the engineering of the oubliette, a term derived from the French oublier, meaning to forget. This verticality was the primary mechanism of control, turning gravity into a secondary warden. The construction process of a bottle dungeon was a feat of precise excavation. The stonecutters would first create a narrow aperture in the masonry floor of a fortified tower. From this single entry point, they carved a bottleneck shaft downward through the solid rock. As the excavation deepened, the shaft flared outward into a wider, L-shaped chamber. This specific geometry ensured that the walls were not only impossible to scale, but were also structurally reinforced by the surrounding earth. In Nottingham's jail, the air within these voids stagnates, cooling to a consistent, damp temperature. You watch as a prisoner is brought to the rim of this shaft. The method of entry is purely mechanical. They are secured with coarse hemp ropes and lowered through the ceiling aperture. The friction of the rope against the stone lip produces a low, rasping sound that echoes upward, a testament to the fact that there is no ladder, no stairs, and no other means of egress. The physics of the oubliette were designed to deny the human body its most basic navigational instincts. Once the prisoner reached the floor of the pit, the rope was retracted, leaving a void of several meters between the floor and the ceiling. The floor itself was not a flat surface. To prevent the inmate from seeking comfort, the masons paved the bottom of the dungeon with sharp, jagged stones. These limestone fragments are arranged with their points facing upward, creating a surface that punishes any prolonged contact with the flesh. To stand for hours on such a surface causes the arches of the feet to cramp. The darkness in these depths is absolute, save for the faint, circular disk of light visible through the trapdoor far above. You hear the heavy metallic thud of the trapdoor being slammed shut, a sound that vibrates through the rock walls and signals the finality of the prisoner's geographical removal from the world of the living. Within this vertical narrowness, the sensory environment is defined by its limitations. The walls are slick with condensation, a byproduct of the inmate's own respiration reacting with the cold sandstone. There is no ventilation beyond the narrow gap around the ceiling trapdoor. The prisoner's world is reduced to the tactile sensation of the jagged floor stones and the auditory measurement of time through the distant sounds of the jail above, the clatter of keys, or the muffled footsteps. Historically, this design reflects a shift in punitive philosophy. It was no longer sufficient to merely hold a body. The architecture itself was now a tool of attrition. The Nottingham Gal's construction in the early 1300s served as a model for this type of total containment. Technically, these pits solved the problem of security with minimal maintenance. While the stone walls provided the Crown with security, they also created a hidden space. The master of the jail recognized that, while the architecture was designed for security, the internal economy of the prison was designed for profit. The evolution of the vertical bottle dungeon into a pervasive network of incarceration across the 14th century did not merely arise from a need for security but from a calculated fiscal opportunity. By 1355, the incarceration of the human body has been fully codified as a commercial asset. You observe this transition not in the damp stone of the oubliette, but in the dry, rhythmic scratching of a quill across parchment. The Crown no longer views the prison as a public service or a weight on the royal treasury. Instead, it has become a franchised commodity. You are witnessing the formalization of the fee system, a logistical framework where the management of human misery is auctioned to the highest bidder. In this year, 1355, the annual rent for the Fleet Prison is set precisely at £20 and 10 marks. This sum is paid by the warden directly to the Crown, a flat fee that grants him the legal right to extract as much wealth as possible from those within his walls. As you watch the warden settle his accounts, the sound of the error is the sharp, repetitive clink of copper coins being counted against a heavy oak ledger. This is the heartbeat of the 1355 prison business model. The warden is not a civil servant. He is a lessee. Having paid his rent to the king, he must now generate a profit. To do this, every movement and every necessity of life within the prison is assigned a fixed price point. The prisoner's journey begins with the mandatory entry fee, a surcharge for the simple misfortune of being processed into the system. You see a new arrival stripped of his immediate fluid assets before he has even reached his cell. If a prisoner wishes to receive visitors, a fee is levied. If they desire the liberty of the yard, the right to walk outside their immediate enclosure for a set period, they must pay for the privilege. This is a cold, mathematical extraction where the prisoner is the raw material and the warden is the master of the refinery. Technically, the system functions as a tiered hierarchy of comfort and deprivation. In 1488, the logistics of London's urban prisons further standardized these costs, fixing the price of a bed at exactly 1 penny per week. You observe the stratification of the inmate population based solely on their ability to meet these fiscal demands. For those with the resources, the prison functions as a grim, high-priced hostel. For those without, the deprivation is absolute. The warden's profit margin depends on minimizing overhead while maximizing fee collection. You notice the ledger entries listing the charity men, those who cannot pay the penny for a bed, who are subsequently relegated to the cold floors of common wards, their very existence a net loss to the warden's enterprise. This financial protocol dictates the physical layout of the facility. The architecture is no longer just about containment, but about the segmentation of paying versus non-paying customers. You walk past the master side of the prison, where sunlight and relatively clean straw are available for those who can navigate the warden's complex price list. Conversely, the common side is characterized by structural neglect. If there is no fee to be collected, there is no incentive for maintenance. The stench of stagnant waste and unwashed bodies is pervasive in these lower sectors, a direct consequence of the warden refusing to allocate funds for the removal of night soil or the repair of ventilation shafts. Every penny saved on the infrastructure of the common ward is a penny added to the warden's bottom line. The air is thick with the metallic tang of unwashed iron and the sweet, sickly rot of infected sores, sensory evidence of a system that prioritizes the ledger over the inhabitant. The administrative burden of this system also falls upon the prisoners' families. You observe women and children at the prison gates, not just bringing food, but bringing the currency required to keep their kin in a bed rather than on the stone floor. The warden's clerks are clinical in their duties, recording each halfpenny with the same precision one would use for a wool merchant's inventory. The legal framework of 1355 facilitates this by making the wardenship a hereditary or saleable office. It is an investment. When a man purchases the right to run a prison, he treats it with the same cutthroat efficiency as a farm or a mill. The fee system ensures that the state's duty to punish is outsourced to private interests, creating a self-sustaining cycle of debt and incarceration. However, this model relies entirely on the steady influx of prisoners who possess some form of liquidity. When the business of prisons failed, the resulting neglect led to perilous conditions and corruption. The privatization of the fleet and the institutionalized bribery of the mid-14th century did not emerge from a vacuum. They were the logical, if horrific, conclusion of a systemic collapse that had reached its first critical mass decades earlier. By 1329, the internal mechanics of Newgate Prison had shifted from a state-mandated holding facility into a zone officially designated by contemporary observers as perilous. You observe the administrative records of the era, where the term perilous is not used as a dramatic adjective, but as a specific legal classification of structural and biological hazard. The duty of care, a theoretical obligation of the Crown to ensure the basic survival of its subjects under lock and key, had effectively ceased to function. In its place stood a void where the physical realities of the dungeon met the cold indifference of administrative neglect. As you traverse the mental map of the 1329 ward, you find yourself navigating a space defined by the failure of basic architectural and social engineering. The heavy, sickly sweet smell of stagnant air and unwashed bodies acts as a physical barrier, a thick miasma that clings to the stone walls and the lungs of the incarcerated alike. This atmosphere is the direct byproduct of overcrowded cells where ventilation is non-existent and human waste is managed with medieval inefficiency. This was the landscape managed by Hugh de Croydon, a man whose name would become synonymous with the institutional rot of the early 1330s. Between 1329 and 1333, the management of Newgate under de Croydon became a study in the exploitation of the indigent. You witness the morning distribution of sustenance, a process that reveals the absolute breakdown of the duty of care. For those prisoners without the coin to purchase food from the outside or the warden's selective pantry, the daily ration consists of foul-smelling scraps, often the discarded offal of local butchers, and water drawn from contaminated sources, prone to seepage from the city's open sewers. The technical result of this contamination is not merely hunger, but a physiological breakdown of the prisoner population. The lack of clean water and the presence of lice inhabit the seams of every wool rag and linen scrap worn by the inmates. These vectors, the louse and the flea, find an ideal breeding ground in the crowded, unwashed environment described in the perilous reports. By 1333, the inevitable biological consequence manifested, the spread of jail fever, known to modern clinical pathology as typhus. You observe the symptoms of this Rickettsia prawisecii infection as it sweeps through the lower wards. It begins with high fevers and a characteristic rash, followed by delirium and, in the confined quarters of Newgate, a high mortality rate. The air in the wards is thick, not just with the scent of decay, but with the heat of hundreds of feverish bodies radiating into the cold stone. The infection flourishes because the prisoners are packed into spaces that ignore every principle of hygiene or spatial distancing. This rampant mortality and the blatant mismanagement of resources eventually forced the hand of the city authorities. In 1333, Hugh de Croydon was forced to face an inquiry into his administration of the prison. The inquiry was not merely a reaction to the deaths, but a response to the breakdown of order and the financial discrepancies that suggested de Croydon was embezzling the meagre funds allocated for prisoner maintenance. You see the scribes of the 1333 inquiry as they record the testimonies of survivors and guards. They document a system where the indigent were essentially left to rot, their presence in the prison a liability rather than an asset. The inquiry reveals that de Croydon's management prioritized the extraction of fees even from the poorest, and when no fees could be produced, the duty of care was discarded entirely. This period marks a shift in the English carceral psyche. The perilous state of Newgate in 1329 was a warning. The typhus outbreaks and the 1333 inquiry were the evidence that the prison had become a site of unintended capital punishment. To be indigent in Newgate during these years was to be subjected to a slow biological execution, mediated by the negligence of men like de Croydon. The technical mechanisms of the prison, the locks, the ledgers, the distribution of spoiled food, all functioned as a single machine designed to prioritize the warden's profit over the prisoner's pulse. As the inquiry concluded, it became clear that the institutional integrity of the prison system was not merely decaying, it had been fundamentally reposed. The physical suffering of the indigent was the friction generated by this new machine, and the records of 1333 show a population that had been stripped of their agency, their health, and their legal protections. For those who couldn't pay their way out of Newgate, the only escape was a desperate plea to a higher power. The systemic failures of the 14th century, exemplified by the collapse of Newgate and the lethal spread of typhus, necessitated a legal reconfiguration. As you move into the 15th century, the English legal system is defined not by a singular authority, but by a dual-track jurisdiction, the secular and the ecclesiastical. You observe a prisoner, hands bound with coarse hemp, being led away from the noise of the municipal square toward the heavy iron-studded doors of a church. This man is not seeking absolution in a spiritual sense. He is invoking the benefit of clergy. Originally designed to protect ordained priests from secular prosecution, the mechanism of plaiding clergy has evolved into a sophisticated legal loophole. By the 15th century, any man who can demonstrate literacy, specifically by reading the 51st Psalm, known as the neck verse, can claim the right to be tried in a church court rather than a royal one. You watch as a clerk opens a heavy vellum ledger, The air here is markedly different from the London streets. The thick stone walls of the chapel insulate the space, creating a cool, quiet atmosphere that smells faintly of beeswax and cold damp, a stark contrast to the roar of the city outside. To the prisoner, this silence represents a strategic redirection of his fate. Church courts do not utilize the gallows for common felonies. Instead, they operate under canon law, which emphasizes penance over execution. However, this is not a total escape from confinement. The Church maintains its own separate and robust prison systems distinct from the Crown's jails. You follow the processing of these ecclesiastical prisoners to the north of England, specifically to the city of York. Here, the Archbishop's prison functions as a significant site of ecclesiastical custody. It is a structure of administrative necessity designed to hold those who have successfully navigated the pleading clergy ritual. The technical reality of this custody is documented in meticulous detail within the diocesan records. You examine a specific entry from the year 1489. A man is held within the Archbishop's walls not for a religious transgression, but for a direct strike against the city's physical security. He was apprehended and imprisoned for stealing the keys to Bootham Bar, one of the primary fortified gateways through York's Roman walls. In the secular world, such an act of sabotage or theft could be interpreted as treasonous. Yet here, under the Archbishop's jurisdiction, the offender sits in a cell of cold limestone, awaiting a sentence that favors incarceration and spiritual reform over the public blade. The mechanism of pleading clergy illustrates the fragmentation of 15th century justice, where the ability to read a single line of scripture can translate into a physical reprieve from death. You stand in the shadow of the minster, hearing the distant rhythmic strike of a hammer from the marketplace, a reminder that the secular authorities are never far away. The Church provides a shadow legal system, a sanctuary of literacy and jurisdictional technicalities, where the law of the land is momentarily suspended by the law of the soul. The air remains still, heavy with the weight of ancient stone and the scratch of a quill on parchment, as the prisoner's literacy records his narrow escape from the hangman's noose. While some found sanctuary in the church, others faced the public theatre of the pillory and the bridle. The transition from the quiet chapel to the chaotic public square is jarring. You leave the cool stone confines of the Archbishop's jurisdiction and step back into the sun-drenched, dusty reality of York's marketplace. Here, the law is not a matter of quiet psalms and vellum books, but of visible, physical shame. The contrast is absolute. On one hand, the benefit of clergy offers a hidden clerical path for those who can navigate the written word. On the other, the secular authorities utilize the body as a canvas for punishment. As you walk toward the center of the square, the smell of wood smoke and livestock replaces the scent of incense. The 15th century stands at this crossroads, a world divided between the sanctuary of the cross and the harsh, unyielding steel of the crown's justice. The ritual of the legal loophole ends here, as the city prepares for its next display of public order. The transition from the 15th century ecclesiastical courts to the 16th century secular theatre of justice represents a shift from the salvation of the soul to the systematic humiliation of the body. You observe that the reprieve once granted by the pleading clergy has evaporated, replaced by a rigid social engineering that utilizes the public square as its laboratory. In this era, the law is no longer a silent transaction in a bishop's court. It is a loud, mechanical, and highly visible performance designed to enforce communal silence and behavioral conformity. The state has realized that the threat of death is often less effective than the permanence of a shattered reputation. You stand at the perimeter of the market square, where the architecture of correction is on full display. At the center of the clearing sits the pillory, a heavy timber frame consisting of two parallel wooden boards. This device, a marvel of basic carpentry and psychological cruelty, is designed to hinge open and snap shut around the neck and wrists of the offender. You watch the constable manipulate the iron bolts, the grease on the hinges catching the morning light. When the offender is secured, their head is thrust forward in a posture of forced submission, leaving the face entirely exposed to the elements and the mob. Public shaming often involved chaining victims to the pillory for days at a time, stripping away the privacy of basic biological functions. and leaving the individual at the mercy of the crowd's fluctuating temperament. The mechanics of the pillory are supplemented by more specialized instruments of vocal control. You notice a woman being led toward the center of the square, her head encased in a construction known as the scold's bridle. This is a framework of iron bands, a rigid mask designed to be worn for days to punish speech deemed disruptive or subversive to the social order. Its application is precise. A flat piece of iron, the curb plate, is inserted into the mouth and pressed down upon the tongue. The biting cold of iron against the tongue acts as a constant physical reminder of the cost of dissent, while the exterior cage of the mask signifies to the community that the wearer has forfeited their right to participate in human discourse. The metal absorbs the heat of the wearer's breath, creating a condensation that drips steadily from the chin, adding a rhythmic, chilling physical toll to the psychological weight of the mask. As you move through the crowd, the sound of a jeering crowd rises to a crescendo. This is the theater of shame in its most active form. The noise is not merely a byproduct of the punishment. It is an essential component. The mockery, the hurling of rotten produce, and the rhythmic chanting serve to reinforce the boundaries of acceptable behavior. For the authorities, the goal is total social control through the weaponization of the neighbor. You see bystanders calculating their own safety by the volume of their insults, ensuring they are seen as part of the virtuous majority rather than the shamed minority. The pillory turns a spectator into an executioner of character, ensuring that even after the wooden boards are unlocked, the prisoner remains trapped within the invisible walls of social ostracization. While the market square handles public offences, the interior spaces of the 16th century correctional system focus on the internal mechanics of the mind. You observe the implementation of devices designed by legal theorists like Ippolito Marsili. Marsili, a doctor of law, advocated for methods that broke the spirit without necessarily destroying the flesh, a precursor to modern psychological warfare. The primary tool for this was the Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat of wood or iron onto which the prisoner was slowly lowered by ropes. This device was not intended for rapid execution, but was specifically designed by Ippolito Marsili to prevent sleep through psychological pressure and intense, localized physical discomfort. By suspending the body in a state of constant, agonizing tension, the interrogators could bypass the prisoner's willpower, exploiting the physiological breakdown that occurs when the brain is denied rest for consecutive days. This method represents a pivot toward the analytical application of pain, moving away from the chaotic violence of the medieval rack toward a more calculated, duration-based torment. And technical precision begins to define every aspect of these rituals. The chains used to tether offenders to the pillory are measured for specific lengths. Every element of the scold's bridle, from its tightening screws to its abrasive internal plates, is a testament to an age that seeks to quantify and mechanize the human experience of shame. As the centuries progressed, the messy theater of the pillory gave way to the industrial precision of the Enlightenment. The public theater of shame, defined by the wooden grain of the pillory and the iron bit of the scold's bridle, faced a crisis of efficiency as the 18th century drew to a close. The Enlightenment demanded a decoupling of punishment from perceived cruelty, favoring instead a systematic, clinical approach to the management of bodies. You observe this shift through the lens of Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, who in 1789 proposed a device intended to standardize the end of life. His proposal was not rooted in bloodlust, but in the mechanical egalitarianism of the French Revolution. The guillotine was designed to eliminate the fallibility of the human executioner, replacing the varying strike of the axe with the gravity-fed certainty of a weighted bascule and a 45-degree angled blade. You hear the heavy slide of timber against timber, a sound that signifies the industrialization of death, moving it from a messy ritual of skill into a reproducible event of engineering. While the mechanics of the scaffold became more streamlined, the economics of incarceration underwent a parallel transformation. The transition from medieval cruelty to industrial management did not alleviate the financial burden on the prisoner, rather, it codified it. You examine the records of the Fleet prison, where the privatization of punishment reached its peak logistical maturation. By 1490, the inflationary pressure on the prison trade had forced the rent for high-status rooms to £40, a staggering sum for the era that signaled the transformation of the dungeon into a predatory real estate market. This economic stratification ensured that the quality of one's restraint was directly proportional to the depth of their purse, a precursor to the modern correctional industry. The air in these crowded corridors is stagnant and heavy, smelling of tallow candles and the damp stone of long-term confinement. As the 19th century progressed, the physical landscape of the past was frequently rediscovered beneath the feet of the industrializing world. In 1816, laborers and urban planners in London uncovered a subterranean reality that had been forgotten by the modernizing city, an underground prison hidden directly beneath the hole-in-the-wall pub. This rediscovery provided a tactile link between the 19th century present and the archaic past, revealing cramped, lightless cells where judicial oversight had been non-existent. You observe the stratification of the soil as layers of history are peeled back. The architecture of the underground cell is primitive, designed for total sensory deprivation and physical stasis, contrasting sharply with the burgeoning logic of the modern world outside. This drive toward total control necessitated a refinement in the design of personal restraints. The heavy blacksmith-forged shackles of the medieval era were cumbersome, often requiring a hammer and anvil to set or remove. In 1912, George Carney finalized the transition to modern mechanical policing with the invention of the first modern ratcheting handcuff. This device replaced the fixed-size iron rings of the previous centuries with a swinging bow. You hear the sharp, metallic click, the sound that represents the absolute precision of industrial-age policing. Unlike the medieval chains that weighed down the body through sheer mass, the Carney design utilized a triple hinge system. Each click of the gear is a calculated reduction in the subject's agency, a physical manifestation of the state's ability to seize and hold with mechanical indifference. With the advent of modern restraints, the ancient stone gates of the medieval world finally began to close. The industrialization of the 20th century, characterized by George Carney's ratcheting handcuffs and the mechanical precision of the guillotine, eventually gave way to a quiet bureaucratic obsolescence. By the early 21st century, the grand engines of historic incarceration reached their terminal point. Newgate Prison, a name that once commanded terror across the British Empire, finally closed its gates. As you walk through the contemporary corridors that have replaced these ancient sites, you observe that the transition from a site of active punishment to one of historical preservation is marked by a specific acoustic shift. The relentless clamor of iron bars and human distress has been superseded by the hollow whistle of wind through an empty modern corridor, where the climate control systems hum with a clinical, detached efficiency. This silence is not merely an absence of noise. It is the physical manifestation of the decommissioning of historical sites. To understand the silence of the early 21st century, you must analyze the structural stratification of the ruins left behind. At the hole-in-the-wall site in York, the rediscovery of carceral layers revealed a complex archaeological record. You examine the cross-sections of the earth where the Victorian brickwork sits atop medieval foundations, proving that the modern prison system was not built in a vacuum, but grew directly out of the stone strata of its predecessors. This site highlights the evolution of the debtor's cell, a space that defines the intersection of finance and physical bondage. Historically, those imprisoned for debt were not isolated from the violent elements of the population. You observe the architectural records from the 18th century showing that debtors were routinely housed with dangerous individuals convicted of capital crimes. This lack of segregation was a primary point of 18th century medical and social concern, as the contagion of both disease and criminal behavior was thought to diffuse through the shared air of the ward. The technical reality of medieval imprisonment was fundamentally custodial. The original purpose was not punishment in a modern sense, but rather the temporary holding of an individual until a fine was paid or a trial was conducted. However, the data reveals a steady drift toward the institutional. What began as a scattered collection of dungeons and towers evolved into a permanent, self-sustaining industry of confinement. You note the transition from the warden as entrepreneur, who charged prisoners for their own bedding and water, to the state-sponsored bureaucracies of the 21st century. The metallic tang of oxidized iron still clings to the remaining gate hooks, a reminder of the physical cost of this transition. As you move through the decommissioned space, you find the legacy of the debtor's cell reflected in the very materials of the walls. In the 18th century, the gall fever or typhus was the primary risk factor for those awaiting financial settlement. Today, the risk is replaced by the sterile isolation of the modern cell. The technical evolution shows a shift from the crowded, chaotic wards where the indigent and the murderer shared a floor to the hyper-individualized cage of the modern era. You observe the markings on the stones at York, where centuries of scraping iron and shifting feet have worn depressions into the limestone. This is the carceral legacy, a permanent mark on the physical world. The decline of Newgate and the subsequent excavations in York demonstrate that the carceral industry has never truly disappeared. It has merely changed its exterior. By the time the final locks were turned in the early 2000s, the prison had moved from being a central public spectacle in the heart of the city to a peripheral administrative concern. You see this in the architecture, the move from gargoyles and heavy oak to reinforced concrete and acrylic glass. The air in these abandoned sites is dry and tastes of gypsum dust, a direct result of the lack of human respiration in space once crowded to the point of suffocation. The study of these sites is a study of human shadows. While the active function of the Newgate site has ceased, the data gathered from its decommissioning provides a definitive map of societal priorities. The fact that debtors were once subjected to the same structural violence as violent offenders tells us more about the value of capital in the 18th century than any ledger could. The closure of these sites does not signify an end to concepts they housed, but rather a relocation. The doors are locked, but the stones of the Mamertine and Newgate remain as monuments to the evolution of human shadow.